magazine about Scotland's culture, politics, and ideas en français. And I write a weekly column in the National Rights here in Scotland. I am thrilled to be your chair today. Before we dive in, a hearty welcome to all of you joining us today for a fascinating and eye-opening lecture by Professor Danny Dorling. The event is proudly brought to you by the David Hume Institute with the support of News Direct in this beautiful building of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So thank you for having us today. Quick heads up, we don't have any fire drills today, so if the alarms decide to make an unexpected appearance, just make your way calmly to the nearest exit. And may I also ask you to kindly put your phone on mute or silent, please. One more thing, just so you know, we're recording today's event, so it would be a shame to keep it just for us, so just to share it to the world later. Now, let me tell you a bit about our speaker. Professor Danny Dorling has joined the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford back in September 2013, taking up the prestigious Halford Mackinder Professorship of Geography. For the next 45 minutes, he'll lead us on an exploration of his latest book, Shattered Nation, Inequality and the Geography of a Failing State, exploring how Britain lost its role as Europe's leading economy and made itself one of the most unequal countries. The title of Danny's book, and in particular the word shattered, which is quite a strong word, got me thinking about, and you're not going to expect this, Lady Gaga and Beyoncé's words in the video clip of Telephone that was back in 2009. So they're driving away from a prison, they're talking about various things, and they talk about trust, and they say something like, you can mend a mirror when it's broken or shattered, but you'll still see the cracks in the reflection, or something like that. This led me to wonder, could that be true for the UK as well? Will Britain bear the scars of the inequalities that are described in the book for a long, long time after the fractures are repaired? Once Danny wraps up his talk, we are eager to hear your questions. I'm sure there will be many, so may I also ask you to please get to your point so that we can get as many people as possible to ask questions. That's enough from me. Without further ado, let's hand over to Professor Danny Dorling. The stage is yours.
Thank you ever so much for coming, and thank you for the invite to be here. I'm going to talk to you for about 40 minutes. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures. But there are actually no pictures in the book. There are no pictures in the book, partly because people are put off by buying books with graphs in them, but also because I worried that people might think I had deliberately picked these graphs to look truly awful, whereas I haven't. They are a bit depressing, but I'm going to try not to make this too depressing, but also I didn't have to worry about copyright. So the 150 graphs are all on the website. They're all available for free. As much as we could put about the book is available for free, including what people have said about it so far. It comes out on the 19th of September. And I expect it will be greeted in England with claims that I am unpatriotic, that I am talking the country down, the country being the UK in England, that I have got my numbers wrong for some reason, and that it's a terrible shame that the University of Oxford employs people like me, which I can then use as an example of how shattered we've become because they're employing people like me. What I want to talk about is the future and how much better things can, and I think very likely will be. I'm going to give you a lot on what is not right, and hopefully we'll talk much more about what could be done next. I've only got 50 of the 150 slides for you, so let's start. The first one. There are lots of incredible things happening at the moment. One thing which is incredible, I've spent now over 30 years drawing graphs of the state of the countries of the UK. It's now incredibly easy to draw graphs about things that are terrible, but also there's hope. The payoff is that were negotiated in 2023 at the start of this year are the most progressive pay offers we've seen since the 1930s. Trade unions, instead of demanding a simple single percentage pay increase for all their members, have agreed tiered increases, where those at the bottom have got the most and those at the top have got the least. This has been going on for some time, but becomes most obvious now. Civil servants, top civil servants, have seen their pay fall in real terms by 25% since 2008, lower ranking civil servants by 12. It all feels bad, but the gap is narrowing. How big is the gap? The graph here is the OECD measure of income inequality. All the countries that the OECD include. We are on the extreme. I suspect by Christmas we will be the most unequal in Europe. It all depends on the data for Bulgaria. Us and Bulgaria are constantly vying for top place in this international ranking. Bulgaria, by the way, is where the people who set up the Trussell Trust went to when they saw children who were hungry at the station there. And then 3 years later worked out they needed to open a food bank in Wiltshire and no longer go to Bulgaria. But if you can see, got very good eyesight. Here's the United Kingdom. We're more unequal than Israel, including the West Bank and Palestine. We are right next to the United States. This is our income inequality measure. Our nearest European neighbour is Italy, the country we're most similar to in terms of our politics, although our government is more far right than the Italian one, according to the Financial Times. Then you get Spain, and then you have Germany and France. It's the black and the purple lines, and only 4 countries now separate Germany and France from Finland. Northern Europe is going Nordic, just not us. Or depends what us means, because us are shattered. The attempts to go Nordic here are laudable and in some ways, I'll end on this, quite incredible. A lot of you will be very familiar with this, but the children from the school will not, I suspect. When I was your age, I grew up in the second most equal country, large country in all of Europe apart from Sweden. It was the most equal Britain had ever been. For the first time ever, most children went to school with other children. Life expectancy had never been more even across the country. People lived longer in Sheffield than the national average. We had the lowest infant mortality rate in the world shortly before I was born. We had baby incubators. We were at the top. We had the most progressive housing policy in all of Europe. I can go on and on about it. And the gap was really low. Middle 1970s were the best. You're going to get a bit about how wonderful the 70s are. Okay, I was only 5, 6, 7 or 8 years old, but I knocked up for the Labour Party twice in 1974, so I really was there. Here's the huge increase in the 80s. You all know about that. What people are often not aware about is the flatness of the 2 lines. The error on the surveys is 1%, which means that in no single year did New Labour move inequality 1 iota by significance. The only year, in fact, it may have happened was 1 in 20 years, which is what you expect with a 5% error rate on your confidence limits. So it's, at least they stopped it getting worse. Just kept us just below Bulgaria, but that was it. What are we good at now? And okay, you could be more positive about this. We're very good at winning records in the Olympic for sports, where you sit down. But banking of a particular kind, a kind that is now outlawed in the mainland of Europe. Those book titles kind of give you a clue. And we're now also the world leader for international gambling. So these are growth industries along with overseas students. In terms, not in number, Germany has more, 330,000 doesn't charge them, in terms of income. So we are relying on things which are not necessarily safe, and this is worrying. How did we get to this situation? Again, here's the flat line that occurred for so many years. We've become utterly used to living in this society. If you're middle class, you may go across to the continent and see how other people live, or you may have rose-tinted memories of your childhood, but it did shift. In all countries, politics always shifts together. All the political parties move in one direction, they move back in another. When we became more equal, which I'll show you in a graph a little bit later, all our parties moved to the left. From the middle 1970s onwards, all our parties moved to the right. Mrs. Thatcher actually celebrated this in her quote here. It was a private dinner, but widely reported, 2002. Her greatest achievement was Tony Blair and New Labour. We forced our opponents to change their mind. What could be said is that by moving to the right, Tony Blair forced the Conservatives to move even further to the right. He forced his opponents to change their mind. What we have now is far to the right of Thatcherism. Here's a map of Europe with every country shown by the number of Conservative voters in that country. And you'll notice that one country is missing, and that's because after 2014, the Conservative Party left the European People's Party and aligned itself with a far right group in the European Parliament, including Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. Our mainstream political party became the centre of the European far right, along with UKIP. It was terrible news for the European far right when Brexit finally occurred. They were down to about 20 MEPs in Poland. There's an Adam Smith Institute in Poland. It's very small. It's kind of, there might be many bad things about Brexit, but absolutely fracturing the European far right is quite a good outcome of it. More graphs, and you can go on and on. I'm mainly showing you these. You don't have to look at them or read them, but I'm honestly not making this stuff up. And I don't even have to do the kind of complicated things I used to do 30 or 20 years ago of getting the raw data and working out what's really going on. This is just ONS data now. My income inequality data is OECD and from the IMF. Right? There's no need to look. This is the public sector being decimated repeatedly. Number of people working for the public good going down from 1992 onwards, with some waves, with all the kind of complexity. The light grey bars are trying to work out when you suddenly privatise part of the public sector, is it private or not private, and so on. Gone up with the pandemic. We did hire some more people in the pandemic to deal with that disaster, and it'll gone up more recently because we've nationalised further education. Really good things are happening. Things that haven't happened for decades are occurring. Peak inequality may have been 2018. We don't yet know. So that's public servants going down. In austerity, the really huge drops are, that's your adult social workers no longer knocking on the doors of people to see if they've fallen to the bottom of the stairs, right? All that kind of collapsing. However, public spending has gone up. Here's public spending all the way from 1980 through to 2026. You might be thinking, how can I show you 2026? Every country in the world tells the IMF what it intends to spend. So they might tell you what they're going to do, but they actually tell the IMF that they're going to spend less. You can see the 80s fall. It's the first one. A bit of a rise under Nice John Major. It wasn't bad. Then another fall. Conservative spending plans kept to in 1998, 1999. Then a rise under New Labour. Although, if you take out the Iraq War, half of it disappears, the spending on that. Huge rise in 2008. That's the banking crisis. That's bailing out the banks. George Osborne's austerity, all the way down. That spike is COVID and the pandemic spending. And this is what's happening now and what's planned to happen. But it's going up. Aging society, people demanding more. And it includes, and it matters for the UK, spending on defence. Okay, so it's not all public spending that improves people's lives. How do the other large countries of Europe compare? Here's Italy, France, Germany, and Spain. And you'll begin to work out that the next 35 minutes of me speaking, less 30, is going to be along the same lines. I'm not fixing this at all. There's France, 53%, and on the streets, and in yellow vests, and rioting, which is partly how you keep 53%. and we don't do it. And you can see the similarities with the banking crisis rising and the similarities with COVID. And if you look in detail and look back, you'll see that only one country ever spent less than us of the large European countries. And that was the country which was just getting out of having been governed by a fascist leader, Franco. And if you think that's flippant, that's Spain. Let's put in the rest of Europe. And Spain is joined, if you're really fast at looking at graphs, by a little blue dotted line below our red line. And that's Greece just after the generals were in charge of Greece. Right? So it's only undemocratic countries in Europe. We, of course, are incredibly democratic. We have this wonderful House of Lords. You know, I was really enjoying the royal palaces as I arrived here and all that kind of thing. Huge variation. You're looking at 2 or 3 national health services worth of difference in what you get for this. You get good normal schools if you spend properly. Governments spend better than the rich. People who are poor spend better than governments. Basic thing of spending. 1970s. Can we have a hand up? Who was an adult in the 70s and is willing to admit it? Great, that is a third of the audience. Who was a child in the 70s? Well, another third. Okay, so we're in 3 groups. We're in the really new to the 70s for adults, children of the 70s, and I'm afraid the third of you have no idea what we're talking about. Okay, let's go forward. 1970s, best decade ever. Don't believe the historians. They all went to private schools, Dominic Sandbrook and so on. They had a bad time in the 70s, and they were too young anyway. Liz Truss has written about the 70s. She wasn't there. Here's earnings. They went up higher than inflation for most years in the 1970s. People didn't become poorer. Okay, it was chaotic, but it wasn't destitution. You're comparing completely different times when you compare this. It was good if you were white, male and straight, of course. Here's Brighton Beach in the 1970s, a quote from George Monbiot about the environment. George is an annoyingly skinny man who looks like... I won't go on about him. We are, of course, the fattest people in Europe, along with the Bulgarians. There are all kinds of correlations with inequality. What else happened in the 1970s which was wonderful? We desegregated our schools. They copied us in other countries. We were the leader. The Finns came to look what we did and then created the world's best education system. Somebody needs to produce this graph showing the secondary moderns going down, which is what really matters, you know, not the grammars. I have a debate coming up with Peter Hitchens in Oxford. I know, and I've got to be kind. There's a nice politician at the back who has taught me about the importance of kindness. Poverty fell in the 1970s. It's measured between the censuses. Our first decent modern poverty survey was 1968. And then rose, and then rose, and then rose. And of course things weren't good. This is a picture my friend Mary Shaw took over 20 years ago. I was standing guarding her, not realising there was no need to guard her whatsoever. This was Shelston in Glasgow. There's a child, if you've got very good eyesight, in the top window, there's sewage coming out of the wall. It's been demolished. What's happened in Scotland to housing is quite incredible since devolution, what's occurred. But things did get very bad after the 80s. And the real contrast is the trend between Scotland and England. I was working out this morning, I first came to Scotland in 1990, and I'd lived for several years in Newcastle. I lived there for 10 years, but I was shocked by what I saw when I came here to Edinburgh, and then as a postgraduate student simply walked out for 3 or 4 miles to different directions and saw what poverty on the edge of Edinburgh was like, let alone Glasgow. By the way, if you're taking photographs, where you need a minder is when you take them in rich areas. That's where the police get called and so on. We try to take photographs of contrasting areas. I'll show you a photograph in a minute. It's really hard to get photographs of poor places and rich places in the same shot. Turns out we engineer our landscape in Britain. That even if you use a GIS to tell you these two places are similar, here's the altitude, this is where you need to put your camera, now get in the car and drive, there's always a hedge or a fence in the way. House prices were getting cheaper. Okay, things were getting better. There was campaigning, of course. Another nice person at the back did a film called Kathy Comes Home about it. We cared more about things. And then we let it run rip and go away. Kensington, just before the pandemic, 1 in 29 people in Kensington were officially homeless. 1 in 29. Almost all living in temporary accommodation being supplied by the local council. Improved slightly with the pandemic, only because we thought that the homeless were going to kill us, and we made them all cut off the streets until we realised that we're all going to get it. Latest data for Kensington is 1 in 29 again. It's now the constituency of the housing minister, Felicity. She went to Christ Church College, Oxford. She was there when I was there as a child. She slept in a bed within 50 metres of where the majority of people who died under 65 died in Oxford, which was the homeless shelter. She'll never have known that. The most common way in which you die as a young person in Oxford is to die homeless. Yeah. If I do a talk in the school I went to in Oxford, I have to tell the young people that they are more likely, statistically, to die on the streets of my city than to get to my university. Right, that's the situation of the country we live in. And why do they end up dying on the streets of Oxford? It's because it's where you go back when your life falls apart, when nobody wants you anymore, when your family doesn't want you, when your boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't want you, when you're taking the drugs, you go back to where you went to school. That's where you end up. It caused a huge shock to Oxford City Council after the 18th person, I think it was, died, and they realised that apart from the man from Poland, they were all people who'd grown up as children in the city. Right? Part of this Shattered Nation book, a lot of it, is about the southeast of England, about what's happened to the southeast. We now have a much higher rate of child poverty in the southeast of England than Scotland has. Right? Just couldn't be imagined. Strikes. So what can you do about it? And the history. This is the ONS official series of strikes. It's just numbers of strike days along the side. Year along the bottom. Really ought to be adjusted for the number of people in work, in which case the 1920s are even more dramatic. People thought the 1926 general strike had failed. It didn't. When I show you the inequality curves you'll see. People talk about how many strikes there were in the 70s. And yes, there were a lot, but nothing like the 1920s. Although in 1 year in Oxford, the men in the car factory in the early 70s went on strike over 600 times in 1 year, which is quite an achievement. And here is what's happened most recently. For people with really, really good eyesight, this is the strikes currently that are happening. Okay, and it's tiny. And why aren't we getting them? This is gig workers, which Labour may or may not decide they care about, depending on whether Angela or Keir wins their argument in London or not, if you follow your politics. I'm going to skip over talking about unemployment. I'm going to go straight to how bad things are. We are currently in the worst, longest squeeze of living standards and pay since the Napoleonic Wars of that began in 1798. You have to measure these things. You have to measure and compare. You have to measure life expectancies. You have to measure how the access to housing. You can't simply rely on some feeling that it was bad or good at a certain time. You have to measure things to know how they compare. Here's the measuring over the longer time. And there's 1798 to 1822, which is the current record. There aren't many countries in the world which have records that go back this long. And it did look like this particular crisis was not going to be as bad as that until inflation took off and got really bad just at the point when the lettuce survived for longer than Liz Truss. Right? If you remember, imagine you're writing a book called Shattered Nation, and you begin writing it 2 years ago, and you're finishing off writing it in the middle of all of that, and you're thinking, well, I thought people needed this book 2 years, a year ago. But honestly, if anybody doesn't believe we're shattered at the point when the international bankers tell the Prime Minister she can't do what she wants to do. Some more demoralizing quotes for you. And again, in the 1990s, I had to pick, fellow travelers, the usual suspects, the enemy within, to quote. Now I can pick Stephanie. Stephanie's very, very nice. She works for Bloomberg. Did used to work for the BBC, but Bloomberg, be nice, being recorded. Bloomberg do pay more, and the bank did. Stephanie explains that the poorest fifth of people in the UK are now poorer than the poorest fifth in most of Eastern Europe. Right? The Financial Times has taken over from the Guardian. You really know when we're not shattered anymore. When the Guardian returns to being a decent newspaper, as it was in the 60s and 70s, campaigning and pioneering, then you'll know that things are getting better again. But anyway, John Byrne Murdoch has been producing graph after graph after graph for the FT. Why does the FT do it? Because it's now the paper of record for Europe. That's where the FT sells. That's its audience. And hence, that's why you get the best news in the FT. How bad are things? If you made the mistake in England of having a brother and a sister, and you're alive now, most of you will be going hungry about 3 times a month. Most children in England with a brother and a sister, or a brother and a brother, or a sister and a sister, are going hungry because of not getting child benefit for the 3rd child. These statistics on hunger are completely out of place. And these kind of graphs, you've seen them for years and they're very complicated, but they're now showing something much worse than before. The Resolution Foundation produced the most of them, very middle of the road. But luckily, the reality has become so simple that even their complicated graphs are now easy to understand. So here's the Resolution Foundation's latest graph on what's happened. And they divide the income groups into 20 just so they can show all the complicated nuances of what's going on. But it really is rather simple, isn't it? Only one group is doing well. And you can see where that bar is. And they're right at the very top, where this is what shattered feels like, when 95% of you are getting poorer, but 5% are actually seeing their income rising because of their take from those rents. I was talking to people here about their rents in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and why has it gone up? The landlord increases it because they've got to pay the higher mortgage, but why not add another £100 as well? And interest rates going up mean that if you have wealth, your wealth grows faster than before. What can you do about it? You can do hundreds of things if you want to. The problem is not wanting to. And the problem is being told you can't do these things and believing it when they tell you you can't. Last night, somebody was saying at a dinner, oh, you can't possibly do some compulsory purchase because the European Human Rights Act says that property is sacrosanct. I think, well, how do we build HS2? How does the rest of Europe manage to do anything? You're told that you can't intervene in the price of basic goods, but they do in the rest of Europe. And on Greece, since 2014, the cost of your frappuccino is determined by government. Your cheese toasted on a beach can only be whatever it was, €1.40. You can see the list of prices there. These are the prices for eating out. This isn't the control of prices of basic goods in the supermarket, which are there. There's all kinds of things you can do if you don't want people to go hungry. This is being done so people can have a social life. And I love the fact it doesn't apply if you choose to go in the first-class train carriage, in which case, sod it, €20 for an espresso. And that, if you want interesting experiments, all public transport is free in Luxembourg, but still 2% of people choose to pay to sit in a first-class carriage. And you've got to watch out for that 2%. It's when that group get into power, when you vote for them without spotting them. They're there everywhere. They're in all societies. It's not their fault. They don't know what empathy means, but they do know what they don't like. And countries that do well control their selfish and greedy. Countries that do badly push them up and up to the top cornflakes. Most complicated slide. If you try to work out the living standards of 7 children in the UK now, you will discover that 4 of the 7 are living in what I would call poverty. What I would see, you can see the amounts of money if you're a very quick reader there. This is done by taking all 14 million children in the UK, splitting them to 7 groups of 2 million, picking the middle child from those 2 million. And the thing which most shocked me when I did this is that the middle child from the best off 2 million, who I call Gemma, as I make these people real in my weird mind of numbers. Gemma has a mum and dad who run a corner shop. They're making £25,000 each on top of their expenses and housing costs a year. That's £25,000 a year after housing costs, benefit and taxation. So they have a disposable income of 50,000. Gemma's the rich kid, right? £50,000 disposable income a year. You are that top child in 7. Gemma's parents could just about afford to send Gemma to a private school, but they'd had no money for holidays. That's rich, right? Not me. I'm way up there. I'm a university professor. Not doctors, they're way up there. People who run a corner shop successfully have a child who's doing better than the other 6 out of 7 children. And below, if you want to see the world I live in, and many of you will live in, you can look at the children in the top 7th percentile, 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and the top 1%. And in the top 1%, you're looking at a disposable income of 621,000 a year. That's an average, which is meaningless for the top 1%. But people in the top 1% think that they can only just get by on that. And they really do. Imagine that something terrible happens to you. You're made Prime Minister. Your income drops so that you're in the 2nd percentile, around about 175,000 a year. You can't even afford wallpaper. Right? You can't. And okay, it's a joke, but and they are so scared of increases in taxation at the top. They're so scared of their lives being decimated. And by they, I mean me, people of my income, people above Gemma's family, people for whom increasing taxes for those on £80,000 would be life-ending. You can no longer send your children to North London Collegiate School or afford to live in the catchment of Camden Girls. Your nice racing bike that gets you to the Guardian offices in King's Place, is out of scratch. You'll have to get another one. Your annual holiday with, let's not name any journalist names, but that rather modest little villa on the edge of Lake Como is off, as is the skiing holiday, as is the second car. Because if you're playing the game down there, if you're in the 1%, the 2%, the 3%, the 4%, the 5%, and that is it for policy making in Britain, that's us, then the idea of becoming poorer is terrifying, which is why things don't happen. And that's just becoming normal is terrifying. This is not the fear of this. It is not the fear of having to deal with the universal credit regulations, which an artist friend of mine has now turned into a 17-foot long Bayer tapestry when she prints them out on material. You are not frightened by this, the fact that we have by far the highest geographical inequalities in Europe and have had for decades. There's Edinburgh for you, just as an example. You'll know it, red around the outside, green in the middle. If you're very nerdy or up looking at the graph, try and work out the 2nd most unequal country in Europe. Right, that's the fun. Also, notice that the y-axis has had to be split because we're so unequal we wouldn't fit on the graph. This is an official EU graph. you can't see the second most unequal country in Europe because they're so similar. What used to be Germany leveled because they cared, basically caring. When the Eastern Länder rejoined the rest of Germany, they cared. We did the opposite. Census came out, 2021 census recently for the UK, and luckily, loads of people can now produce maps themselves, and these kind of maps appear all over Twitter. This is Sheffield, where I lived for 10 years. Somebody wrote an article, "A wall divides our city." This is qualifications. See, we have these Berlin walls all over our cities now. Our supposedly successful clearing of poverty in the middle of Manchester, let's go forward, there we go, to Manchester. We now have social cleansing of the poor from the centre. They just pushed them out. This is the great achievement of the Manchester men of part of the Labour Party. Party I've supported all my life, has cleared the poor out of the centre of Manchester and are proud of it, but created a much more segregated city than the city that existed before. Leeds, Birmingham, Liverpool, right? It's all there in the census. We're very good at data in this country, all becoming poster cities for urban segregation, the highest in Europe, if you want to show what living cheek and jowl by each other is like, which increases the fear, real fear, because you know they're there, right? The stoats and the weasels, right? The people from the other place. What can you do about it? Well, you can partly look at what they did last time and how quick they were to do it. It took 5 years to privatise all the companies that are on that list. It wouldn't take 5 years to nationalise them. It would take a bit of guts and bravado to say that their value of Thames Water is less than zero. So exactly how much you're going to charge all the share holders, not give them back any money, but actually say you owe us. If you want to know what the shareholders of the water companies have done, you have a different water company here, of course. I can get bored about talking about how different, oh yeah, you've got some clean water as well up here in Scotland. This is the building of reservoirs. You'll notice when the building utterly stopped, which is when the shareholders took over. Why would you want to build a reservoir? All you've got to do is just turn the water off in the summer if it runs out. Here's the long-term graph of inequality. It was really high, comes down really fast. People didn't notice in the 1920s or 30s when it was coming down. It's a bit like now. It goes up really quickly from around about 1974. It's the tax records that Piketty's used. What's been growing as our inequality has been rising, the highest growth for 40 years, has been in management consultancy. If you Google how to become a management consultant, the first hit I get is how to fill in a self-employed guide to self-assessed tax returns to minimize your tax liability. Education. Right. This is the spending on state schools and private schools and what happened since austerity. But let's click forward because you'll be sick of graphs by now and are no longer grateful I'm only showing you 50 of them. We'll get into the end. This appeared in the Times newspaper. Big gap between what Labour did and the Conservatives. Labour kept the relative funding the same as the percentage, which meant the real funding gap got bigger and bigger in absolute terms. Right? But that was Labour's idea of equality, was you increase the proportion it goes up by the same. Conservatives come in and you really need to cut the amount of money you spend on state schools because you've got to reward people who are not feckless and save and work hard and care about their children enough to send them to private schools. And what do you then get? You get the worry that people like me being recorded on that camera clearly don't care very much about private schools, and you might not get into the university you want to. So if anybody's watching and they're worried, I'm not an admissions officer at the University of Oxford. I don't get to decide who comes in. But also a third of our children in Oxford go private. So you can work out whose children that is and then maybe not be quite so scared about the university. And your child is still 4 times more likely. But what's the point? What is the point of getting to an elite university in a country that in no way is any longer elite? What is the point of following the man from Lincoln College, Sunak, who followed the lady from Merton College, Truss, who followed, I won't go through them all, but I know every bloody one of them. Because I grew up as a child in the 70s and 80s, cycling under the walls of these places as they threw their champagne glasses out at us. And it's not good. And we know it's not good, and it's depressing. And we can measure the use of depressants, which is what this statistic is about, and how it's going up, and how it's the highest, and how we really are. And there'll be people in this room who are medicated now, which helps you get through, but it is not the same vibrancy. And then, okay, we take less antidepressants than in the United States, but we're taking more than the rest of Europe, and more and more and more. And our life expectancies are falling, and they fell from 2014 to 15, 16, 17, 18. And what did Public Health England do? They said, oh, they're not falling, rather than should we address them? And we lost more people from austerity and deaths due to austerity than from the pandemic, the worst pandemic we've had since 1918, 1919. And thankfully, the FT produces graphs of the number of austerity deaths, so at least we have it for the record, so that in future people can look back and say, this is what really happened. But they kind of accepted it. They just lived with it. You know, they live with one of the lowest rates of old people in Europe because our old people die more than other old people do. And not just living with the old people dying, but being willing to live with an infant mortality rate, a neonatal mortality rate, where only 5 countries in Eastern Europe, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Romania, and Malta, if you're choosing where to be born tomorrow, you know, if the Grim Reaper suddenly appears now and you're spirited off and we're all panicking what to do with you in the chair, and you discovered that actually the way things work is you're told, hey, don't worry, you're going to be reincarnated. Don't choose Slovakia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Romania, or Malta. But all the rest of Europe, you have a higher chance of not dying in your first 4 weeks of life than the UK. This, the country which had the best child health record in the years before I was born. And it goes on and on. The graphs can go on, which you can see now why I haven't put a single graph in the book, right? Because it's too depressing, isn't it? But I've got you trapped. But these are fun. Let's start getting happy, because I've got to speed up. Do you remember David Cameron's happiness index? And it's going to make everybody happy? Just after he hugged what was it? A husky? A hoodie. He's hugging a hoodie, yeah. He hugged a hoodie, and then he flew out to the Arctic to say how much he cared about the environment. Anyway, when the Prime Minister tells ONS that they're going to have a happiness index, they create one. And here it is, and they measured happiness, life satisfaction, and are things in life worthwhile. And it actually got better. Now remember, 2008-9, we had the biggest financial crash since 1929. So we were a bit scared. So it's not surprising people felt a bit better after then. But then the most incredible thing happened around about 2015. And you'll see things a lot in worthwhile in life began to shoot up then. Life satisfaction went, happiness went. We had an announcement of a referendum that was going to happen, which happened in 2016. And you might have thought that referendum might make people unhappy, but it didn't, because all the people who voted to leave, well, they were happy because they got what they voted for. And the people who didn't vote to leave, well, they weren't yet unhappy because they thought, oh, we're not going to leave. There's no way we're going to do this, you know. So it's just a recommendation. And at the same time, down in England, the largest social movement in Europe began to emerge. 500,000 people joined a political party, which had ideas which it hadn't had for decades about doing things differently. And the happiness level rose. The people who liked Nigel Farage were happy because they were getting what they wanted. The people who thought we could have redistribution and proper social European social democracy were happy. And it was all great until the autumn of 2019, when the happiness levels absolutely collapsed, months before we knew about a virus from China. in the days just before an election in December 2019, when the most terrible thing happened to the UK, which was a large majority for Boris Johnson, and the happiness measures that David Cameron had instigated recorded the effects of that on the people of the UK. And it was bigger. The election of Boris Johnson coincided with a bigger fall in life satisfaction, things are worthwhile, right? A bigger rise in anxiety than the advent of the most unpredictable, unknown, scary, dangerous virus that we had seen in our lifetimes. SARS killed 1 in 3. We had no idea. When the reports came through from the villages in Italy, you know, it could have been 10 times worse than it actually was. But that didn't upset us as much as Johnson becoming Prime Minister, on average. And then what he did. Here's anxiety. And you can see anxiety hit that peak before, and this is before any realization of the pandemic, you know, just something odd's going on, don't worry too much, you know, nothing will have to change. I do think it's quite remarkable. Banksy picture for you. Going to end with some pictures, and then we'll have a chat about the scariness and the weirdness of it. The rest of Europe has PR. You don't end up with, and of course, not just the rest of Europe, large parts of the UK have forms of PR. Our moral compass goes wrong, becomes skewed. This is the Tory leader, Baldwin, talking about the press and how terrible they were in the past. We're not yet a failed state, but you kind of have feeling something else is going to happen, don't you? Like quite a lot has happened. You've become used to it. What's next? My money is on sterling. Maybe it's a safe currency. Maybe somebody will have a go. What happens if they have a go? Most of our food's imported. Inflation in food is still 18%, even though general inflation has fallen slightly. Food hasn't. We're in trouble. But it could be the housing market, not just gently gliding down as it is at the moment, but just coming off a cliff. All kinds of things. You're often told that the old are doing okay. Well, this is actually what they're really getting. They're not getting the triple lock because the reductions in other benefits for elderly people, disability benefits and so on, mean that the elderly are only a few pence better off by 2020 than they were in 2010. So the government that says it cares about the old hasn't actually looked after the old. It's managed to convince them that it still cares about them. And the generation that most strongly voted for them, and still does, are the generation who've died in greatest numbers from austerity and the pandemic. There are very few of them left now. I take this picture as we're very near to the Royal Mile, but the moment at which the elderly man, waiting for that feeling that was going to come over him when he finally put the thing on his head, didn't get the feeling. And I do, well, I hope he says some things that might be useful. We're all in it together. Well, we're 3 slides to go, okay? We're almost there. This is about what's happening to pay. This is a picture in a newspaper. The boss of my union, Joe Grady, tweeted it to say how terrible it was that university lecturers' pay has gone down this fast, but this is what happened in the 1920s and 30s. This is what meant that somebody like Tolkien could live in a large house but not a mansion in North Oxford, and could hire an au pair from Iceland to look after his children, who looked rather like an elf, if you like your sorts of stories. But later on, no Oxford academic could afford to live in that house again. And they couldn't send their children routinely to Winchester, St. Paul's, which they used to do, because inequality fell in the 1920s and 30s. And this is what's happening now. And although it means suffering for everybody, the greater falls for the better off is what it has to happen if you're going to get a more equal society. The best news story. Hopefully he's there at the moment. I haven't seen any news reports. Has there been a camera opportunity? Is Camilla and Charles, are they in Balmoral? Yeah, I think they are. Okay, well, they can celebrate because they're in the only part of the kingdom which has done the most dramatic thing. You almost certainly know a small Scottish child payment was brought in during the worst of the cost of living crisis starting. £10 if you had a child aged 6 or under, not much. November last year, it was increased to £25 a week for every child under 16 if you claim any form of benefit. For a family of 3, think of those children going hungry in England with a brother and sister. For a family of 3, that is almost £4,000 a year. That means no child going cold and no child going hungry. Stunning. The biggest fall in child poverty anywhere in Europe for at least 40 years. Right here. Done here. Not reported at all in England. Really cheap. Really cheap to do. Quite staggering. I produced the Gini coefficient curve for the children of Finland. Scotland has suddenly matched it. It's just unbelievable. Okay, you're not going to look after the old. They're still going to freeze to death and so on as much. Yeah, it's choices, but it is an incredible thing. All kinds of things are possible. We have more bedrooms and more housing than we've ever had before. We just have more empty rooms than we've ever had before. Need a little bit of building, not very much. We have more school teachers than any other country in Europe. It's just a large number of them, including, I think, the majority of geography teachers, are teaching just 7% of children. Right? It's the most inefficient, wasteful education system in Europe and ineffective. We spend far, far more on health than other countries do now. But because we've shattered our country so much, a doctor cannot afford to live in the city, so they demand salaries. They pay their doctors and nurses less in Finland. And at the worst, waiting times could be, 7 weeks, and at the best, 3 days. And they say it's not good enough, which is how it's better. There's so much you could do, but you have to know, A, do not argue about whether you can afford the Scottish child payment in Scotland. Just do not even argue about it, just pay it. Right? Biggest success story in social policy in the UK for 40 years. You don't need to provide evidence of an inherent stupidity of British people by saying this is maybe not a good idea. And look to all the solutions that are happening. And as we run out of money, as we become poorer, we're going to have to start to do these things. Right? Because we cannot promise people the sunlit uplands. We cannot say that just around the corner it'll be okay. Don't worry, growth will sort you out, right? There is a limit to people's tolerance and patience to listening to that crap. And it's come and it's ended. Hope. And some final quotes for you from Hope. We never really noticed at the time the politicians who talk about hope or bring hope, or that the fact that they even existed all managed to get elected mean that hope is possible. We don't look back at the 1920s and actually say in the 30s and say, look at what they actually managed to do. Here's Václav Havel and here's Raymond Williams. And that's me making sandcastles, which is my favorite. Very cheap, very fun. Right? You can't do it on the shores of Lake Como. Right? The sand is no good. You can do it in Britain. It is just as fun as an expensive foreign holiday for those people who send their children to North London Collegiate and write editorials about how it's okay to be like we are at the moment in The Guardian. I can even take The Guardian writers on a sandcastle building course, should they wish. And we can together rent a caravan from Haven Holidays and be happy, and we can drink red wine, and we can talk about our books that we've written about policy and so on. And we can get poorer and happier together. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Danny Dorling, for this reality check, I think, would probably be the expression. We're gonna open the floor to questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hands. There are going to be 2 roving mics. And as I said earlier, if you can keep your question relatively short so that we can give an opportunity to as many people as possible to ask questions.
Thank you. Right, I'm Paul Hare, retired professor of economics from Heriot-Watt University, and I found this talk extremely interesting, but I have to confess, not very cheery. And I think when I go home, I'll probably buy the book and try and learn a bit more about it, because a lot of the issues that you've talked about are things that have bothered me for quite a long time. But there is one issue that I don't think came up really in the talk very much, which does bother me a lot, and that's how shockingly badly we manage major infrastructure projects in this country, which just seems a horrible symptom of being a failing state and just not functioning and delivering things for people. So it's the infrastructure area that bothers me a lot. Thank you.
And there was a second question at the front, just here.
Hello, Titus Alexander. Thanks very much for a rather depressing but all too familiar litany. And the question really is, what do we do about it? And in particular, 2 questions relating to what can our so-called intellectual power that we've got in universities and political scientists and economists, what can they contribute to help people solve this problem? And the second one is, how can Scottish independence make a difference?
Thank you. Yes, infrastructure tends to be worse and fall apart more the more unequal you are. So, you know, the USA has trouble building pavements at times, and certainly not a good public transport system. Finland, where I was last week, they excel in building bridges and things despite having a lower GDP per capita than us. And a system of ferries, this might matter to some of you. You wouldn't believe, have a look at the archipelago at Turkle, you wouldn't believe how many islands there are off Finland. A system of bridges and ferries where they don't charge, they just build them. Why would you bother charging for them and employing people? And it's this, just look at other places. We don't look. We just look to the USA. And they go, oh, we're not as bad as them. We must be doing okay. We're in Europe. We really are in Europe. I'm a geographer. I can tell you. We are. Yeah, what can political scientists do? A lot of the run-of-the-mill work is very useful. John Byrne Murdoch's graph showing that the Conservatives are the most far-right party relied on data collected by hundreds of political scientists who didn't know what it would be used for around the world. So the boring research work, you know, does have purposes, even if a journalist gets all the credit for it. I'm English, so I'm careful what I say about independence. It worries me less. I think the greatest achievement of that lovely woman of around my age who grew up in Glasgow and, like my wife, was a fan of Wham, if you know who I'm talking about, the Scottish Child Payment is an achievement that I would count as greater than achieving independence over just the changing of lives. However, there is a question about what it takes to embed long-term these things. Finland would not be Finland if it hadn't become independent around about 1917. It does help to control yourself. It helps to know your elites, not to be governed by a set of people so far away in such a large country that you don't do well. But I would as much concentrate on achieving the actual policy goals in constrained circumstances where you do not have the freedom to tax at the rate that they tax in Germany. The 2017 and 2019 Labour manifestos, all costed, were only suggesting increasing after 5 years public spending to the level that Merkel, the Conservative, was doing in Germany. Right? That and that you can't do without independence. But celebrate the achievements and find something more interesting to argue about than them. Right? I know everywhere argues. In Finland, they argue. They're very upset. The Conservatives are in power. The Conservatives are to the left of what Labour was in 2017, 2018 in Finland. But they don't like it when I tell them that. They still say they're terrible, terrible people because their morals shift. But try and find more useful things to argue about than some of the things that are being argued about, because for somebody from England coming up on the train, you do think, you've done so much. It's so incredibly impressive. On a European scale, this stands out by a country mile. And why bother arguing, particularly the two main parties in the Scottish? What on earth are you doing, playing at? Because you could lose it. You really could lose it. And that's what Westminster wants. Because you're the enemy within. You are showing it is possible to go another way. You're showing that the world doesn't fall apart when children can go to university without having to get a debt of £100,000, right? You are doing things which are seen as dangerous to the future of the country that they think of as the UK. So fighting amongst yourselves just seems silly under those circumstances. And you could lose the Scottish Child Payment, which means tens and hundreds of thousands eventually of children going hungry and going cold every year because of middle-aged, middle-class people arguing amongst themselves. And that simply must not be allowed, I think, to happen.
There's a question here at the front and on the same row. And a second question?
I'm a Guardian reading former BBC journalist, shoot me now. My name is Claire English. I'm wondering why we're not more revolting. Because look at the French. They go out there and they get things done. Yeah? I just wonder what is wrong with us that we don't get so offended by all this. Maybe we do more in Scotland, I don't know.
Okay, I'll try and answer those two questions together and shortly, because I think they're connected. What is wrong with us is our history. You know, when you mentioned Beyonce at the beginning and put a ring up on it, I was thinking of you're going to do the put a ring on it quote. Sorry, my tragic knowledge of pop. Scotland and England came together as a marriage of convenience because we saw the Spanish galleons with the gold and we worked out we could be better together, and we created an empire, and the empire became very, very big. And we created a school system which was designed for empire, and a university system designed for empire. We didn't really have ancient universities. We want to pretend we did. They were monasteries and they did no work whatsoever that was academic. We built schools. We expanded some like Eton that had been around earlier, but we built others like fetters, which are military schools to train young men how to be violent, and a system of hierarchy of education, top public schools, minor private schools, grammar schools eventually for the more skilled of the working class and lower middle class, secondary moderns for the rest, technical schools, all this kind of thing. And we had a university system where you had to go away from home. You couldn't go to your, not here, but in England. You have to go and leave your family because you're going to have to go overseas. And my department was opened or advertised in 1899 with an advert in the Times to train young men in this new discipline of geography, which would give them the skills they needed to learn about mountains and rivers and seas and people and cities so that they could become colonial officers. And we were subjects of a king and a queen and an empress. And we didn't riot. We hadn't since Peterloo. When the money came in, which we thought came in because we were so good, we did better. I first went to France at the age of 15 before I'd been to Scotland on a school trip on a bus. and my mum gave me £1, and I think the exchange rate was 10 francs to a pound.
Yeah.
I was 15. I had 10 francs. A bottle of wine was 3 francs. Right? And this isn't, well, it's incredible. It was land of milk and honey, but I felt sorry for them in France because we were rich, and that was. So we have no history of protesting. We didn't protest in '68. We don't know how to do it. We grumble and so on. So we don't know how to do it. I have BBC correspondents come up to me, recording me for Channel 4 documentaries, who tell me quietly, and I've done enough, so I'm not giving it away. I can't question the market in what I do. It's not allowed. I wouldn't keep my job at the BBC. We quietly whisper in the ears of academics our complaints. How do you end it? These silly divides. Because the rest of Europe doesn't have these schools. Even the US has hardly any of them, apart from California. A mixture of things, and probably slowly. I wouldn't ban them. I'm in favour of plurality and allowing people. If you manage to make us more equal by income, the number of parents who could afford to send their children private dramatically drops. If you remember, I said if you take 7 children in the UK, the best off 7th is Gemma. Her mum and dad could just about send Gemma to a private school, but they'd have no money for anything else. Well, imagine if you properly taxed people above Gemma's level. And then suddenly when they're thinking of using, and I've talked in these schools, because I only get the invites from private schools, because state schools are too knackered to invite academics. The parents couldn't afford to send them. They'll have to become academies and nationalise themselves. You can introduce the taxes, which Labour are still committed to, or get rid of the tax reliefs so that we're not actually subsidising people going to them. But much more positive and much more better than all this, although I do it, is you improve the coordination of state schools. So if you take the 5 state schools in my home city of Oxford, which includes one of the worst performing in all of Europe, in Oxford, right? Imagine instead of them each having separate senior management teams and being members of different multi-academy trusts run by business people whose company records are all available to see, so you can work out which ones were only created companies simply to avoid tax. This is how I spend my long evenings, looking through them. Imagine if the schools of a city like Oxford were all run by a single senior management team and they could share their resources. One school could specialise in science in A-level and have the best labs in the city. Another could teach Russian and German and Spanish, because although there aren't enough children in any school to learn those things, there are enough children who want to learn them. Children can cycle around because the city is tiny, and you make it safe by introducing bus gates, which we're doing, and 180 electric buses, which we're doing in Oxford. We have £40 million from the Conservative government, thank you. We have people trying to burn the cameras because they're stupid. Because the buses are used by poor people, right? Imagine you can do that. Why would you send your child to a private school for a worse education than one in which they mix? And you can move the teachers around as well. So you don't have all your teachers aged over 30 only teaching in 3 schools in my city, 2 private, 1 state. Already, when I was your age, if my parents had sent me to the nearest private school, I would have been 20 times more likely to go to university. 20 times. Right? That's worth doing. That's worth the money. If you think going to university is what matters, then increase my chances 20 times. In my year, which wasn't a great year for my school, out of 300 children, most of whom left at 15, 6 of us went to university. That's just 2%. I was the posh boy. I was always going to go. Right? But 2% of us went, as opposed to 40% from the local private school. Now, my school is still the bog standard average comprehensive, but half the children go to university. So why? What are you protecting your children from if you send them private? All you're doing is making it much more likely that they'll feel that they're a disappointment at 22, 23, 24, 25. I know these are my friends' children. You've spent all that money on their education, and okay, they've managed to get into Leeds and Manchester, but they didn't get into wherever they were supposed to. And they're having to mix with this huge mass of normal children who've gone to normal schools, who know how to learn by themselves because they haven't been spoon-fed, so they find university far easier. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible mess that doesn't benefit anywhere. And I can go on, and we need a study of the amount of drugs used in different schools. But I put it to you very, very simply. My children can take £20 out of my wallet, and I don't know. Which is why the state school that my children go to has a bigger drug problem than the poorest state school, which has a little bit of marijuana and that's it. But nothing like the problem with drugs in the schools where people can take a lot more than £20 out of their parents' wallets. Right? If you're worried about drugs in schools, you need to worry about private schools. And there are things we don't talk about. Last one to leave you with, we still need to worry about boarding schools. My whole life, story after story about boarding schools. Okay, the numbers are going down. People are not sending their children to boarding schools now, but yeah, it all needs to be sorted out. It will. And people have to be proud of going to state schools. You know, I am proud of going to a normal comprehensive. When I turned up in Oxford, there was a big thing back in the University of Oxford. We just hired our first head of a college who'd went to a comprehensive. Aren't we nice and diverse? Right? It's just normal. It's normal. And there are massive advantages, as the rest of Europe shows, from going to school with everybody else, right, and not getting special attention and treatment, learning how to mix with other people. Okay, my English is still awful. Nobody taught me grammar. I now know you have to put verbs in sentences. But it's not the end of the world if somebody doesn't teach you grammar. You can still write quite a lot of books without somebody having taught you individually how to write.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I was a teacher in the 1970s, and I empathise with a lot of what you said. One of my two passions, education and electoral reform. Can I say, on the education side, many of the initiatives that I worked very hard on at all levels was very much destroyed by the professional self-interest, and that's one of the things we have to tackle. But the other side of that is our electoral system, our democracy in Britain, and it does seem to be noticeable that other countries in Europe and the developing world have got much more sophisticated, responsive political systems. But those of us who have been promoting change of political systems are rather sort of shoved to one side and considered to be nerds and anoraks. I mean, is there any chance of redemption in this area, and do you think it is a significant driver?
Yeah.
My question?
Yeah. Yeah.
What difference between your baseline data gathering and the taking so much more than 2 for each stuff? Am I right that it's all based on the total population? Because the poorest people in our communities are the asylum seekers who are going to get assistance payments and wouldn't be eligible for the sort of sharp end of rooms like that. Can you just point to how that affects you a little bit?
Yeah, let's do PR first, and then the more complicated one. It does really matter. You can tell it matters because the US doesn't have a democratic system, actually worse than ours in some way, over how the senators are elected. And I think it's Singapore, but countries without democracy tend to be more unequal and do badly. The anorak thing comes from worrying too much about exactly what kind of PR you have. You can always change it after you get one in. Whatever you do, don't do a referendum about it. It just trains. That trained a young Dominic Cummings. The most dangerous thing that referendum did. He won that one as a young man. It will come in at some point. There's a kind of inevitability to this. Most of Europe got it over 100 years ago. If the Liberal Democrats have a backbone, which we don't have evidence of, given what they agreed to do with Cameron in 2010, they will not form an alliance if Starmer needs an alliance unless he promises within 100 days to introduce legislation on PR. I worry then about who else Starmer might go into power with, but there will come a time when there will be a party or politicians at the top party who begin to realise what you get with PR is about 8 or 9 parties. You have a party you can actually vote for. You might have two different green parties, deep green, less quite deep green. I would have the party you can tell I like, which is the left party in Finland, possibly the Link in Germany. I'd be happy. I wouldn't have to think about how I vote. I just vote, I might think occasionally. But you also have a lot more politicians. And that means a lot of politicians who have to have other jobs because they're not going to be in power. And in Portugal, you can't walk into a university in Portugal without stepping over a former member of parliament who is now a sociology professor again. But it's not just academics who move in between. And this creates you a much wider set of people who are your politicians than the set that we currently get. I think what will happen, I don't think these things are easy to predict, and I think it'll happen in a kind of crisis where it'll be part of a deal that has to occur. On the baseline data, it is tricky. The reason I use 2018 for my 7 children is that's the last time we had a decent households below average income survey from DWP, which does try to include people who are asylum seekers, but of course they're very likely not to want to talk to the interviewer, but at least the interviewer knocked on the door to do it. So it excludes some of the very poorest, and it certainly excludes a few of the very richest, who are very good at hiding as well. But we are good at doing data. We had the only surveillance survey of COVID in the world that happened every week. Madrid did one early on, once. The monitoring of this virus was done by this country. There's a weird thing about collecting data in Britain that is very useful for people like me. So at least it is documented. And it's people working for DWP in the office in Long Benton in Newcastle who've been doing this for years, and they really are trying. The scary thing will come if and when they are sacked. I shouldn't really say this, kind of luckily our politicians in power think so little about data that they don't think it's dangerous. So although they wanted to get rid of the census, and they probably will, they haven't done the kind of cuts to ONS that Margaret Thatcher did when she cut it by OPCS by 25% when she came in. And there's this record of getting rid of information. More progressive governments tend to collect more and actually want to know what is happening.
We can take a few more questions. There's 2 at the back there.
My question was a little bit about the differences that you talked about in terms of sector and income and addressing inequality. So you made the kind of remark about management consultants and people that work in the public good, as in they work in the public sector, but not all private sector work is kind of nefarious purposes. Some of it does a lot of public good. And I wondered what you saw for the role in the private sector, kind of the transitions that you might need to see in that around reducing inequality. And I also wondered on the pay differential, when you compared salaries between those in the private sector and in other industries, does the pay for those in the public sector include things like pension contributions and in-work benefits like adjustments for annual leave, maternity and paternity benefits, and all those kinds of things that the private sector might not offer?
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your Thanks very much for your talk, and thank you for the book. I think it raises all those issues of working people up to the fundamental problem of inequality and injustice in the whole of the UK. You mentioned in the talk, to me, but it didn't say a great deal about it. I wanted to expand
Thank you. Yeah, private and the state sector. I must stop doing this thing. I'm private sector. I've always worked in the private sector. My university is a private sector organisation. Our money is now entirely private. Since fees were introduced by Tony Blair and then increased to 9,250, there was almost no government money coming in. I'm included in the private sector separately. There are people who work in the state sector who don't make life better for people, and there are lots of people who work in the private sector who do, and there are nice management consultants, and there are even nice estate agents. And the poor things, if you want to feel sorry for estate agents, they get cold at times like this. They all simply get sacked, and then they get hired. If you wonder why they're all so young and in suits even cheaper than mine, it's not fun in the private sector. And the pay deals are interesting. So this relates to the second question. It's much harder to find details of all the pay in the private sector. But the Communication Workers Union, 4 years ago, they asked for a 3% rise for everybody, which increases inequalities. They work for the private sector. Their latest agreement is the most complicated tiered agreement where the lowest paid people working for BT have got the biggest increase and the highest less. The Murdoch newspapers, although I only know this from being told it's not published, I think it's their high-paid journalists getting salaries of over 80,000 have had no increase on their salary over 80. The increases have only been lower down. So the Murdoch newspapers are doing progressive pay deals like everybody else is. And their members, when you talk to the journalists, so many of them, they don't like what they're having to write. So it is a small number of owners and a small number of editors and some others. I'm going to get one bugbear off. I wasn't going to mention, but I will. I wrote an article before doing this talk, which appeared in the Scotsman, which I think is in effect the Times of Scotland. Am I right? It's owned by Murdoch. Okay. And the Scotsman reproduced my words exactly. Quite brilliant, lovely. But they added a dozen links. And I would like to know the name of the sub-editor, please. So it's on the record. I'm sure one of you can find out who it is. And the first link, when I put in the word economy, links to something saying exactly the opposite to what I was saying. And the second, and so on. Now, maybe the sub-editor was bored. Or maybe they want to make their boss happy by showing that, although they have published this obvious mad left-wing person, they've put in some links to the truth elsewhere. But it is either extremely childish or extremely pointless or worrying. Just one story in the Scotsman 2 days ago. Right. The media in general, and this stretches from the BBC and the Guardian through, and we don't concentrate enough about the BBC and the Guardian, have moved, along with our political parties, to the right. The Today programme, I listen to it religiously because I want to know what the Conservative Party are thinking. It's an internal conversation. And as soon as you see it like that, it makes much more sense. But that's just neutral because we're a conservative country. The BBC was incredibly progressive in the past. This was news being broadcast to everybody. You couldn't filter who was getting what. This was new media. You can go through. Children's and satire was by far the most. That was the week that was for people older than me. Monty Python, the young ones, the clangers, the revolutionary. Go through, and the satirizing. But then as our country moved to the right, BBC reporting over the Belgrano was the beginning, and you see it also in the Guardian reporting about things, particularly the Guardian reporting of 2019. You see the paper reverting to what it actually is about, which is not changing things too much. Actually being happier with Boris Johnson because it will be less of a change. Between the lines, I'm annoyed about the Guardian. And I know enough people in the Guardian don't like what they're doing, and they work there. So if the Guardian folk are watching this, the person sitting at the desk next to you doesn't like what you're writing. They just can't tell you because you're senior and paid more than them, but they don't like you. How do we get our media back? It's a long-run process to do it. The Finnish media, my last mention of Finland, the Finnish media is unbelievable. Just how much there is of it. and how neutral it is. And in some ways, you might say boring, and in English as well, put up and available. Explaining this, saying you're not happy. There are people at the BBC who will absolutely complain that they say we're trying really hard to be neutral, and you saying that we sound like the Conservative Party in an internal discussion isn't helpful. But saying I'm afraid that is what you sound like, and telling the Guardian it's the same. We do need a left-wing newspaper in this country. The Mirror doesn't do badly. But the Mirror isn't doing it because it cares. It's owned by the same company, I think, that own the Express. It's just making money. Now, you can put in laws. You know more about this than I do, about how you can control your media. But I think it's the moral sentiment that matters more. I said this morning, I have this favourite quote from a banker called Oswald Folk. And Oswald is a friend of John Maynard Keynes. And this is when Keynes introduced his general theory about the economy in the 1930s, and things were changing. And as Oswald Folk said, what you've really done, it's not a clever economic thesis and so on. What you're really doing, and you and your friends in Bloomsbury, these are posh people, what you're really doing is helping change the moral sentiment of what behaviour is acceptable. And that is what's required for our media. You need directors of the BBC who think it's the most wonderful institution to actually start to worry that maybe it isn't, right? And it has to become useful again and open its local stations again, which is going to require a government that actually believes in it. You need the people who are editing your newspapers to have some sense of shame and think they need to be part of something. It'll happen slowly. You won't notice it. You won't feel it. You'll always be angry with them. But your children or your grandchildren might actually pick up the paper or read it on their luminous, whatever, hollow tablet, or get it injected in their brain, and say, this is actually telling the story about the place I live in, which is what our media did when we were most equal. Some of it hated it, but it did. The Daily Mail, on the day of the Beveridge report, had a cartoon and a headline, 3 cheers for Beveridge, of bringing this in, because it knew that its readers were heading that way politically. This is the paper that had supported Hitler not long beforehand.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have more time for questions, but thank you all for your thoughts and interrogations. Thank you very much, Professor Danny Dorling, as well. I think we can give a big round of applause. And now I'm going to hand over to the Royal Scottish Geographical Society.
Thank you very much. My name is Mike Robinson. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. And I'm here to help to celebrate Danny's work, who himself, by his own admission, has spent the last 30 years colouring in graphs. So Danny is one of the UK's leading geographers and one of the most willing to tackle critical issues and critical social concerns. He's been a professor of geography at the University of Oxford since 2013, when he took up the Halford Mackinder professorship, after previously working as professor in Sheffield and many other places. He is a member of the Academy of the Learned Societies in Social Science. He was honorary president of the Society of Cartographers, and in typically multifaceted style is a patron of Roadpeace, the national charity for road crash victims. Throughout his career as a geographer, Danny's dedication to exploring the intricacies of social and economic differences has helped bring attention to many issues which may have otherwise gone unnoticed. And this latest book, Shattered Nation, acts as the perfect example. His books, articles, and public engagements have been instrumental in raising awareness about issues ranging from housing inequality to healthcare disparities, employment, education, and poverty. He has the rare ability to translate complex data into accessible narratives and has developed highly distinctive methods of mapping inequalities, empowering individuals from all walks of life to engage with these critical topics and influencing policy decisions and sparking conversations.
Danny's work also reminds us that we must be careful to ensure that a desire to remain politically neutral must not come at the risk of our becoming morally impartial or indifferent. Professor Dorling is vocal and engaged in the real-life issues that affect us all, evidencing and arguing for good. He is an academic who values the need to improve our lot and keep hope alive, as he mentioned at the beginning of his talk. He reminds us of the vital role of geography and the fact that it is not enough to inform alone. We also need to inspire and, where relevant, influence change. And so it is with the greatest pleasure that I present him with Fellowship of the Society and our President's Medal.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Danny. It's been an absolute privilege to host you in Edinburgh for the last, slightly over 24 hours, but I've learned so much. We've had a small insight today, but there is so much more in the book that we couldn't take any more of your time in. But do read it and digest it. And special thanks to Mr. Page for bringing trademark painful. We are privileged that you managed to escape school this afternoon and hear from Danny. I think it's really about the next generation, and Danny really showed we've got a third is in the paper today with us. Your presence drastically brought the average age really down. We know how difficult it is as a teacher getting out of school, so we really appreciate everything you've done for the paper. The rest of you, and Graham, we have got drinks receptions upstairs. I know I want to carry on talking about this for longer, so please do join us in the informal environment upstairs.